There's a lie most men hear from childhood and never question. They say that if they're good enough, dedicated enough, patient enough, someone will come to help them. They say recognition will come, that the right people will appear, that life will somehow reward their good intentions. But what if that's precisely the belief that's keeping millions of men weak, dependent, and stuck in the same place for years? It may sound harsh, but the truth is that most people spend their lives waiting for something that never comes. They wait for support, they wait for understanding, they wait for approval, they wait for family to finally believe in them, they wait for friends to value them, they wait for society to recognize their potential. While they wait, the years go by. Opportunities disappear, and what could have been an extraordinary life ends up becoming a series of postponements. Machiavelli understood something few dare to admit. The world doesn't reward intentions, the world rewards action. Politics guided by reality, not ideals, begins precisely here, in the ability to look at reality without emotional filters. And the reality is simple. Nobody is coming to save you. Nobody is as concerned about your future as you should be. Nobody wakes up thinking about how to transform their life. When this truth finally enters a man's mind, something powerful happens. He stops asking for permission. And it is at this moment that his true transformation begins. Because the man who realizes he is alone discovers something most will never understand. He discovers that solitude is not a condemnation, it is a weapon. It is the exact point where dependence dies and strength is born. It is when he stops living trying to please others and begins to build himself. It is when he stops seeking validation and starts seeking competence. It is when he abandons the need to be accepted by everyone and develops something much more valuable: self-respect. Throughout this video, you'll discover truths that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Uncomfortable truths about approval, relationships, other people's opinions, independence, and personal power. Some of them may challenge everything you believe today, but if you stay until the end, there's a good chance you'll never see your life the same way again. Because there is a huge difference between the man who waits for permission to act and the man who decides to act even without it. And that difference changes absolutely everything. If something inside you awakened while listening, don't ignore that feeling. This channel isn't about videos, it's about memories. Remember who you were before the fear, before the exhaustion, before the silence. Each new video here is a different reflection of your own soul. An invitation to understand what the world never taught you. The power you seek outside has always been within you. If you feel that this journey speaks to what lives silently within you, sign up now. Not to follow yet another creator, but to reconnect with something the world tried to make you forget. Because here, every word was made to heal, each reflection to awaken, and each video serves as a reminder, you are not alone on the path back to yourself. Click on subscribe and turn the algorithm into a daily reminder of who you really are. For much of their lives, many men harbor a silent belief that influences virtually all their decisions. They believe they are being watched all the time, that every mistake will be remembered, that every poorly chosen word will be judged, and that every step outside the norm will be analyzed by an invisible crowd. Because of this, they spend years asking permission to exist. They choose clothes thinking about what others will say. They fail to start projects for fear of criticism. They hide opinions to avoid rejection. And the most curious thing is that while they live trapped in this imaginary tribunal, almost no one is paying attention. This perception may seem harsh at first, but it carries an extraordinary freedom. When a man understands that most people are too busy trying to solve their own problems, something changes within him. He stops wasting energy trying to control impressions and begins to direct that energy toward building his own life. Machiavelli deeply understood this dynamic when he advocated for a politics guided by reality, not by ideals. The reality is simple. people are thinking about themselves. And when someone finally accepts this, they discover that a large part of the chains that bound them never existed. It's almost comical to observe how humans overestimate their importance in the minds of others. A man stumbles upon entering a room and spends 3 days reliving the scene. Another posts something on social media and compulsively checks who saw it, who liked it, and who ignored it. A third avoids starting a business because he imagines acquaintances will criticize him if he fails. Meanwhile, the people he fears impressing are preoccupied with bills, relationships, health, career, or personal problems. They barely remember what happened 5 minutes ago. This understanding shouldn't generate sadness, but rather empowerment. After all, if no one is really watching your every move, then there is enormous freedom to act. It is precisely here that one of the greatest psychological strengths someone can develop emerges. Not the need for approval, but the ability to move forward despite its absence. This attitude connects directly with the idea of virtù and fortuna. Luck may open some doors, but the practical virtue of acting without depending on the applause of others builds an entire life. The man who understands this begins to walk with more confidence because he no longer needs to turn every decision into a public vote. The most interesting thing is that this liberation produces an unexpected effect. The less someone seeks validation, the more presence they begin to transmit. There is a rare tranquility in those who are not constantly trying to convince others of their worth. They don't need to announce their plans to seem important. They don't need to justify every choice. They don't need to win arguments to protect their ego. Their attention is focused on the silent construction of what truly matters. In a way, there is a similarity here to Machiavelli's principle of the appearance of virtue. Many spend their lives trying to appear strong. Others work to become strong, and it is almost always the second group that achieves real results. The end justifies the means when the goal is to abandon illusions and embrace reality as it is. From that moment on, the person stops chasing after people's approval and begins to invest in something much more valuable, the construction of themselves. And when this construction begins, an even deeper truth emerges before them, a truth that reveals that perhaps no one was thinking about them from the beginning. There's a curious phenomenon that imprisons thousands of men without them realizing it. They live like actors on an imaginary stage, believing there's an audience watching every detail of their lives. Before speaking, they calculate how they will be perceived. Before acting, they imagine criticisms that may never happen. Before trying something new, they visualize a public failure that probably no one would even notice. This is one of the greatest thieves of potential in modern life. Man stops living his own story to manage a reputation that only exists in his head. And the more energy he dedicates to this concern, the less energy he has left to grow. Machiavelli understood that people often act driven by distorted perceptions of reality. That's why he advocated a politics guided by reality, not by ideals. The reality in this case is simple. Most people are too busy trying to survive their own problems to keep up with yours. When someone finally realizes this, it feels like removing heavy armor after carrying it for years. Suddenly, moving becomes easier, breathing becomes lighter, and life stops feeling like a permanent performance. The human brain, however, loves to create illusions. It convinces a man that everyone noticed his mistake during a meeting. It makes him believe that the embarrassing response he gave in a conversation will be forever etched in the memory of others. It makes it seem like a mistake made 5 years ago is still on people's minds. But one only needs to observe one's own life to realize the truth. How often does someone remember the embarrassing mistakes of strangers? How often do they spend hours thinking about a stumble someone else made? Almost never. And the same happens with others in relation to us. Each individual is so busy managing their own fears that there is rarely room left to analyze the fears of others. This reveals a powerful lesson. Many of the emotional prisons that seem real are built by repeated thoughts, not by concrete facts. This is where the importance of constant adaptability arises. The strong man is not the one who never feels insecure. It is the one who learns to see when his mind is exaggerating the importance of something and decides to act anyway. This ability creates an advantage that few people develop throughout their lives. Think about how many opportunities are abandoned because of this imaginary spotlight. One man fails to pursue a professional opportunity because he fears appearing unprepared. Another fails to start a channel, a business, or a project because he imagines negative comments. Another avoids expressing his ideas for fear of judgment. Meanwhile, less talented men advance simply because they didn't wait for the world's approval. There's an interesting connection here with the concept of virtù and fortuna. Fortuna can present unexpected opportunities, but only those willing to act without the constant weight of others' opinions can seize them. The calculated use of force doesn't always mean confrontation or imposition. Often it means having enough strength to ignore fears manufactured by one's own mind. It means continuing to walk when there's no guarantee of applause. It means accepting that some people will judge anyway. And when a man finally frees himself from this imaginary stage, he begins to realize something even more uncomfortable and, at the same time, liberating. Even if people were watching him, there would still be something he could never completely control. For a long time, many men have been taught to believe that strength means reacting. Reacting to criticism, responding to provocations, winning arguments, correcting those who misinterpret them, and constantly proving their worth. It seems logical at first glance. After all, those who remain silent are usually seen as weak. But reality often works very differently. The truly strong man rarely feels the need to respond to everything. He understands something that few understand. Every reaction delivers power. When someone can control their mood with a simple criticism, it means they have direct access to their emotions. And whoever controls their emotions controls part of their decisions. Machiavelli carefully observed human nature and knew that many battles are won before they even begin. Therefore, decisions based on real human nature tend to generate far superior results than decisions driven by impulse. Strategic indifference does not stem from weakness. It stems from a deep understanding that not every provocation deserves attention, not every criticism deserves a response, not every war deserves to be fought. In many cases, the greatest demonstration of strength is simply remaining unwavering. Observe what happens in a discussion between two men. One raises his voice, gestures excessively, constantly interrupts, and tries to win by sheer volume. The other maintains a steady tone, listens more than he speaks, and responds only when necessary. Curiously, most people perceive the second man as stronger, not because he is physically superior, but because he exudes control. Self-control always generates respect. This is why Machiavelli stated that it is better to be feared than loved, provided one can avoid being hated. Many interpret this phrase superficially, imagining that it refers only to politics or formal power. But there is a deeper meaning. The man who masters himself transmits a presence that commands respect naturally. He doesn't need to beg for attention. He doesn't need to win every debate. He doesn't need to prove his intelligence in every conversation. His calmness communicates more than long speeches. His emotional stability transforms into a kind of invisible authority. And the most interesting thing is that this authority doesn't depend on anyone's approval. It is born internally and strengthens with each situation in which he chooses not to react impulsively. This doesn't mean becoming cold, distant, or indifferent to everything. There's a huge difference between emotional maturity and apathy. The wise man continues to feel emotions. He continues to perceive injustices. He continues to face challenges. The difference lies in how he responds to them. Instead of surrendering his emotions to anyone who wishes to provoke him, he begins to manage them as a valuable resource. This posture is reminiscent of the logic of one's own loyal armies. Just as a prudent ruler doesn't surrender his security to external forces, the strong man doesn't surrender his emotional stability to the opinions of others. He saves his energy for battles that truly matter. And ironically, the less he tries to appear powerful, the more powerful he becomes. People begin to perceive a quiet confidence that doesn't depend on exaggerated displays. But this discovery opens an even deeper door. Because sooner or later, every man realizes that no matter how balanced he is, there is still something impossible to completely control: how others choose to see him. There's a quiet moment in some men's lives when something changes forever. It doesn't happen with noise. There's no announcement, there's no applause. Simply, a day arrives when he realizes he spent years trying to convince people who were never truly interested in understanding him. He tried to please family. He tried to impress friends. He tried to earn respect through endless explanations. He tried to justify choices that shouldn't even need justifying. And yet, he continued to feel a strange emptiness. The reason is simple. No amount of external approval can fill the absence of internal growth. The man who depends on the validation of others becomes emotionally dependent on them. His happiness rises and falls with praise and criticism. His worth seems to change according to the opinion of the weak. But when he finally abandons this pursuit, something powerful happens. His energy ceases to be directed towards convincing people and begins to be invested in evolution. It is precisely at this point that the practical philosophy of politics, guided by reality, not by ideals, begins to produce concrete results. Reality doesn't reward those who seek approval. It rewards those who produce value. Observe the difference between two men who desire respect. The first spends hours trying to appear important. He publishes his achievements to receive validation. He constantly talks about his plans. He seeks recognition even before achieving results. The second takes the opposite path. In silence, he learns new skills. He takes care of his body. He develops discipline. He expands his knowledge. He works when no one is watching. While one tries to appear important, the other becomes it. And almost always, the second ends up achieving exactly what the first desperately sought. Machiavelli understood this dynamic when he spoke about the appearance of virtue. Many believe that appearance is enough, but appearance without substance inevitably crumbles. True substance, on the other hand, creates a presence that doesn't need to be announced. The man who works daily on himself develops something rare in modern times: consistency. He doesn't depend on motivation to act. He doesn't depend on approval to continue. He doesn't depend on external incentives to grow. His strength begins to come from a much deeper place, and this change begins to alter the way he sees all the relationships around him. From this point on, an interesting transformation occurs. Man stops pursuing people and begins to pursue excellence. Instead of spending hours trying to be accepted by certain groups, he invests that time in developing skills, character, and independence. He understands that virtù and fortuna go hand in hand. Fortuna may offer opportunities, but only those who have developed virtù are prepared to seize them. Therefore, he begins to build a life based on solid foundations. He reads books that broaden his worldview. He learns skills that increase his value. He takes care of his physical and mental health. He develops constant adaptability in the face of life's inevitable challenges. Gradually, his confidence ceases to depend on external circumstances, and the more this confidence grows, the less need he feels to beg for space in other people's lives. After all, those who are busy building their own fortress have no time to beg for entry into other people's homes. But this new posture ends up revealing an even more uncomfortable truth about human behavior. A truth that explains why so many relationships disappear precisely when they cease to be convenient. One of the hardest truths to accept is also one of the most liberating. Most people aren't thinking about you. They aren't analyzing your decisions. They aren't revisiting your mistakes. They aren't following your movements with the attention you imagine. The human brain has a natural tendency to place itself at the center of its own narrative. This makes sense from a survival standpoint, but it creates a huge distortion of reality. A person believes their failure was memorable, their shame public, their insecurity evident to everyone. However, while they mentally relive that moment for the 100th time, other people are already preoccupied with their own problems. Machiavelli observed that understanding reality as it is always produces advantages over those who live trapped in illusions. And few illusions are as common as believing we are the center of attention. Politics guided by reality, not ideals, demands seeing the facts without romanticizing them. The fact is that each person is busy fighting their own battles. And when a person understands this, a huge amount of fear simply disappears. Modern psychologists call this the spotlight effect. It's the constant feeling that a light is pointed at us, highlighting every mistake, every detail, and every imperfection. But this spotlight rarely exists outside our heads. Imagine someone who makes a small mistake during a presentation. To them, it seems like a disaster. For days, they relive the event, imagining the judgment of others. However, by the end of the presentation, most people were already thinking about lunch, traffic, work, or their own commitments. This is the stark reality. The universe doesn't revolve around any specific person, and this should be received as good news. After all, if no one is watching as closely as you imagined, then there is much more freedom to act. There is more freedom to start a project, more freedom to change careers, more freedom to try something new. Virtù and fortuna favor those who act despite initial discomfort. And acting becomes much easier when someone realizes that the audience they so feared may never have existed. This understanding also transforms how a man deals with his failures. Instead of carrying humiliations for years, he begins to see them from a different perspective. He realizes that many of the situations that still embarrass him have completely disappeared from collective memory. People moved on. Life went on. The world didn't stop to record that mistake. Only he continued to carry that weight. This requires a profound change of mindset. It requires abandoning the need to be seen all the time and embracing the tranquility of simply living. The calculated use of force also appears here, because often the greatest demonstration of strength is not impressing others, but freeing oneself from the need to impress them. The man who manages to do this develops a rare kind of lightness. He begins to walk without carrying the weight of an imaginary audience. And when that audience disappears, an inevitable question arises. If people aren't thinking about you as much as you imagined, why continue spending so much energy trying to control what they think? There is a battle that many men wage for decades without realizing that it was already lost from the start. It is the battle to control what others think of them. They try to explain their intentions, justify their choices, correct misinterpretations, and manage every perception created around them. They believe that if they find the right words, they will finally be understood by everyone. But reality rarely works that way. Some people have decided who you are before even hearing your first sentence. Others will interpret your actions through personal experiences, prejudices, interests, or emotions that have absolutely nothing to do with you. Machiavelli deeply understood this characteristic of human nature. People don't see the world as it is. They see the world through their own lenses. Therefore, decisions based on real human nature are usually much more effective than naive attempts to please everyone. The man who seeks universal approval is chasing something impossible, and the more he chases after it, the further he gets from his own authenticity. One of the biggest signs of insecurity is the constant need to explain everything. When someone makes an important decision, they feel obligated to justify every detail. When they change course, they try to convince everyone that they made the right choice. When they are misunderstood, they embark on endless campaigns to correct the image others have built of them. But there's a problem with this strategy. The more someone tries to control perceptions, the more dependent they become on them. Their peace begins to depend on the approval of others. Their mood begins to fluctuate according to praise or criticism. Their identity ceases to be built internally and becomes outsourced to others. This is precisely why many men live emotionally exhausted lives. They spend too much energy managing reputations and too little energy building results. The principle of virtù and fortuna teaches something valuable here. Fortune is beyond control. The opinions of others are too. Virtù, however, lies in how someone chooses to act in the face of these circumstances. The strong man learns to separate what he can control from what he will never be able to control, and this distinction completely changes his life. There's a harsh but extremely true saying, whoever needs to be understood by everyone ends up belonging to everyone. Because to maintain collective approval, they will be forced to constantly mold their personality according to external expectations. Today, they will please one group. Tomorrow, they will need to please another, then another. And so, little by little, they will lose themselves. The wise man does differently. He says what needs to be said clearly, acts according to his principles, and accepts that some people will like him while others will not. This is not arrogance, it is maturity. It is understanding that the appearance of virtue can deceive for a while, but the obsessive search for approval destroys any true authenticity. Better to be feared than loved, said Machiavelli, but always trying to avoid being hated. In other words, it is better to be respected for consistency than loved for constant submission to the expectations of others. When a man stops trying to control opinions, he discovers a freedom that few experience. But this discovery reveals an even deeper and more uncomfortable truth. Many of the people who are by your side today may not be there for who you are, but for what you offer. Few truths cause as much discomfort as this one. Most human relationships have invisible conditions. People like to believe that all connections are built solely on affection, loyalty, and good intentions, but reality is often more complex. Many relationships remain strong as long as there is convenience, benefit, proximity, or utility. When these elements disappear, some people disappear along with them. This doesn't mean everyone is false or malicious. It simply means that human nature works in a much more practical way than most would like to admit. Machiavelli understood this clearly when observing how alliances were built and broken as circumstances changed. Politics guided by reality, not ideals, requires seeing this behavior without naivete and bitterness. The man who believes that everyone will remain by his side, regardless of life's inevitable changes, often ends up disappointed. But the one who understands how relationships really work develops more realistic expectations and therefore suffers less when some connections come to an end. Just observing certain moments in life reveals this dynamic in action. When someone is growing, thriving, and exuding confidence, they tend to attract attention, invitations, and company. But when facing difficulties, failures, or periods of rebuilding, they quickly discover who truly remains close. This happens in friendships, romantic relationships, professional environments, and even within family circles. Many men interpret these experiences as proof that the world is cruel. In reality, they are merely demonstrations of true human nature. People gravitate towards what seems valuable to them and distance themselves from what no longer offers them something emotional, social, or material. Decisions based on true human nature allow us to understand this phenomenon without dramatization. The problem isn't the behavior of others. The problem arises when someone builds their entire self-esteem on the permanence of those people. Those who depend on the presence of others to feel valuable will inevitably live in fear of loss. And the fear of loss often transforms strong men into people desperate for acceptance. This is precisely where one of the most important changes of maturity emerges. Instead of begging people to stay, a man begins to invest in himself. Instead of chasing attention, he develops value. Instead of trying to hold on to relationships through neediness, he strengthens his own independence. Virtù and Fortuna walk hand in hand again in this process. Fortuna determines who enters and who leaves life. Virtù determines how someone reacts to these changes. The man who develops skills, character, discipline, and purpose creates something extremely powerful, undeniable value. And genuine value attracts much stronger connections than neediness ever can. The calculated use of strength appears here silently, not as aggression, but as the ability to continue growing even when someone decides to leave. The less fear there is of losing people, the more authentic the relationships that remain become. And curiously, when a man stops begging for companionship, he begins to see an even deeper truth. In the end, there is a journey that no one can walk for him. There comes a moment in every man's life when an illusion must die so that a stronger version of himself can be born. It is the illusion that someone will come to save him. For years, many people wait for the perfect mentor, the perfect opportunity, the perfect partner, the perfect motivation, or the perfect circumstances. They live believing that there is a future event capable of solving everything at once. Meanwhile, the months pass, the years pass, the dreams remain in the same place. Reality, however, rarely rewards those who wait. Machiavelli understood that the world belongs to those who act, not to those who await permission to act. Politics guided by reality, not by ideals, demands accepting a simple truth. No one is coming. Not because people are bad, but because each individual is busy trying to save their own life. When a man understands this deeply, something powerful happens. He stops looking outward for the solution and begins to look inward. And this change of direction completely alters the course of his existence. Many men spend years saying they will start when they are ready, when they have more money, when they have more knowledge, when they receive support, when they find someone to guide them. But absolute preparation doesn't exist. The perfect moment doesn't exist. Absolute confidence before action doesn't exist either. Most of the time, confidence is born precisely after the action happens. That's why Virtù and Fortuna form such a powerful combination. Fortuna may present unexpected opportunities, but only Virtù allows someone to have the courage to seize them. Think of how many admirable people started without guarantees. Entrepreneurs started businesses without knowing exactly what they were doing. Writers wrote their first books without certainty of success. Leaders made difficult decisions without having all the answers. What set them apart was not the absence of fear. It was the willingness to act despite it. The man who waits to feel ready may spend his whole life standing still, but the man who learns to walk even in the face of uncertainty develops a strength that no theory can teach. What's most interesting is that self-rescue creates something that can hardly be explained with words alone. It creates a different presence, a different stillness, a confidence that doesn't need to be announced. People notice when they are in the presence of someone who has built their own life without constantly depending on external validation, rescue, or approval. There is a rare stability in this type of man, because he knows that if everything crumbles tomorrow, he will still possess himself. His own loyal armies represent this idea well. Just as a prudent ruler does not entrust his security to external forces, the wise man does not completely surrender his destiny to the hands of others. He takes responsibility for his own direction. He understands that the end justifies the means when the means mean discipline, learning, effort, and continuous growth. And the more this independence grows, the less manipulable he becomes. After all, it is extremely difficult to control someone who doesn't desperately need approval, attention, or saviors. But there is one last truth that completes this process of liberation. A truth that completely changes how someone sees their failures, their shames, and even their greatest pains. There's a reason why so many people remain stuck in the past, even when the world has moved on. They believe that certain events are forever etched in memory. A mistake made years ago, a public humiliation, a professional failure, a relationship that ended in the worst possible way. In their minds, these moments remain vivid, continually repeating themselves as if they happened yesterday. But reality is often much less dramatic than memory makes it seem. Time has a characteristic that few properly value. It dissolves almost everything. Conversations fade, judgments disappear, opinions change, people follow new paths, new problems arise, new priorities take up space. Machiavelli understood that life is governed by constant movement, not by permanent states. Constant adaptability arises precisely from the ability to understand that nothing remains the same forever. Not moments of glory, not moments of shame. And when a man finally accepts this, he begins to realize that much of the suffering he carries no longer exists in the real world. It exists only within his own memory. Think of something that deeply embarrassed you 5 or 10 years ago. Maybe it was a rejection, maybe a bad presentation, maybe a wrong decision. Now ask yourself a simple question. How many people actually still think about it today? The answer is probably none. While you carried that episode as a permanent scar, the rest of the world was busy building new stories. This realization is extremely liberating because it dismantles one of the greatest psychological prisons of adult life. One realizes that the universe doesn't keep a secret file containing all of their mistakes. There isn't a crowd gathered analyzing their failures. Most people can barely remember their own mistakes clearly. This is a practical demonstration of politics guided by reality, not by ideals. Reality shows that the world isn't as focused on you as your mind makes it seem. And that's not a tragedy. It's an extraordinary opportunity. Because if past mistakes have lost importance for almost everyone, then perhaps it's time for them to lose importance for you too. But letting go doesn't mean pretending it didn't hurt. Letting go doesn't mean erasing memories or denying difficult experiences. It means stopping carrying a weight that has already served its purpose. It means accepting that continuing to hold on to a certain pain doesn't change the past. It only steals energy from the present. Virtù and Fortuna teach an important lesson here. Fortuna can bring difficult times, unexpected failures, and unfair circumstances. Virtù appears in how someone chooses to respond to these events. The strong man is not the one who has never suffered. It is the one who learns when it's time to move on. The calculated use of strength in this context is not about fighting against everything Often it's about having enough strength to let go of what should have been left behind a long time ago. And when someone finally abandons the weight of old opinions, old mistakes, and old shames, something extraordinary happens. They stop living looking back and begin to walk freely. And it is precisely at this moment that all the previous truths begin to fit together like pieces of the same puzzle. Once these truths become clear, something silently changes within a man. He stops wasting energy trying to convince the world of who he is. He stops turning every decision into a plea for approval. He stops living as if he were permanently before an invisible tribunal. For the first time, he begins to see the freedom that has always been before him. After all, if no one is thinking about him as much as he imagined, if the opinions of others were never under his control, if many relationships were conditional, if no one will come to save him, and if time erases almost everything, then an inevitable conclusion emerges. A large part of the chains that bound him were never placed by others. They were placed by himself. Machiavelli understood that the greatest obstacles are rarely external. Often they reside in the mind. And that is precisely why decisions based on real human nature produce such different results. When a man abandons illusions, he stops wasting energy fighting imaginary battles and begins to invest his energy where it truly generates transformation. From that moment on, he stopped over-explaining himself, not because he had become arrogant, but because he understood that endless explanations rarely change already formed perceptions. He learned to speak when necessary and to remain silent when silence is more powerful. He learned that not every opinion deserves a response, not every provocation deserves a reaction, not every criticism deserves attention. There is a silent strength in those who do not feel the need to constantly prove their worth. It is a strength that does not depend on applause, positions, titles, or external recognition. It is born from the coherence between what one thinks, says, and does. Virtù and Fortuna continue to play their roles. Fortuna remains unpredictable. Circumstances continue to change. People continue to enter and leave life. But the virtù built internally remains. And the more solid it becomes, the less influence external chaos exerts on that man's emotional state. He discovers something that few people learn. Peace does not mean the absence of problems. Peace means not allowing problems to control your identity. In a world where almost everyone is trying to get attention, there is something profoundly magnetic about those who don't need to. In an age dominated by constant displays, there is power in those who work quietly. In an environment where everyone craves validation, there is authority in those who have already found validation within themselves. Better to be feared than loved, said Machiavelli, but always seeking to avoid being hated. And there is a powerful interpretation of this idea for modern life. Lasting respect rarely arises from a desperate attempt to please. It arises from consistency, firmness, and the ability to remain true to one's own principles, even when this displeases some people. The man who understands this abandons the need to perform for the world. He stops living to be accepted and begins to live to become what he was born to be. And when this transformation happens, he realizes something that previously seemed impossible to see. The fact that no one cared much about him was never a tragedy. In fact, it was the greatest freedom he could receive. If you've made it this far, you've probably already realized that this video was never about loneliness. It was never about abandonment. It was never about living isolated from the world. It was about something much deeper. It was about freedom. Freedom to act without needing everyone's approval. Freedom to move forward even when no one believes in you. Freedom to build your own identity without constantly depending on the opinions of others. Because in the end, most men spend their entire lives trapped in invisible chains. Chains made of fear, validation, insecurity, and the need for acceptance. Machiavelli understood that true power rarely begins from the outside. It begins when a man achieves self-mastery. When he stops reacting to everything, when he stops begging for attention, when he stops living trying to please people who probably aren't even thinking about him. Politics guided by reality, not by ideals, requires courage. Courage to abandon comfortable illusions and face life as it really is. The truth is, no one is going to live your life for you. No one is going to build your discipline. No one will develop your courage. No one will pursue their goals with the same intensity as you. And the sooner you accept this, the sooner you will begin to develop something that few people possess: emotional independence. Remember one thing: the man who depends on the approval of others will always be controlled by others. But the man who finds value within himself becomes extremely difficult to manipulate. He understands virtù and fortuna. He understands that he doesn't control everything that happens around him, but he does control how he responds to events. And this awareness completely changes his position in the game of life. Now I want to ask you some questions. Which of these truths struck you the most? At what point in your life did you realize you were waiting for someone who would never come? Is there an opinion you're still holding on to that you should have left behind years ago? And most importantly, what would change in your life if you stopped asking permission to act, starting today? Write your answer in the comments. I want to know which of these lessons had the most impact on you. If this video has given you a new perspective on life, subscribe to the channel right now and turn on notifications. Because here we talk about Machiavelli, human nature, power, strategy, self-control, and the truths that most people avoid facing. The more you understand the world as it really works, the less it can control you. See you in the next video.